Welcome back to Noir Alley. I am your host, Eddie Muller. We are celebrating Black History Month on Noir Alley. Joining me is Jacqueline Stewart, my co-host on TCM and professor of cinema and media studies at the University of Chicago. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Hi, Eddie. Thanks so much for having me. This is such a treat.
It absolutely is a treat because we have a premiere on TCM today, and I specifically wanted you to be here to introduce this film with me because you've actually taught the book that this movie is based on. And I'd like to start off by having you tell us a bit about the author, Richard Wright, and his place in American literature.
Sure. Well, Richard Wright is, simply one of the most important American writers of the 20th century. He had a really powerful analysis of race and class in America. And his novel, Native Son, was a hugely successful and critically acclaimed novel. Published in 1940, it was a Book of the Month Club selection. And the character, Bigger Thomas, is a figure that has been so influential across the history of African American literature and American literature.
And it's sort of interesting. So people are probably thinking right now, well, why is this being shown on Noir Alley? But Richard Wright himself was a fan of crime fiction, pulp fiction, and he actually had an interest in writing for Hollywood. Isn't that true?
That's right, yes. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about this film that we're about to watch is that the novel that it's based on already had a lot of kind of cinematic elements to it. I think you're right that people may not think about the novel Native Son in relation to noir, but if you really boil it down to some of the core aspects of that novel, the kind of existentialist plight of the main character, Bigger Thomas, who's trapped in his social circumstances, the fact that it is a novel and a film that are quite pessimistic in terms of outlook. And, there are women in this film that in many ways kind of echo the femme fatale and the kind of like good girl character that could redeem the central character if he gave her a chance. So there are qualities that really resonate with film noir. And I think it's really exciting to think about how this classic of African American literature can be related to the tradition of noir. And as you were saying, Eddie, yes, Richard Wright was an avid moviegoer, a big movie fan, and he had aspirations to write for Hollywood films. But during that time period, of course, this was just not possible.
Yeah. Interesting to note that in 1941, the year he also made Citizen Kane, Orson Welles mounted a theatrical production of Native Son starring Canada Lee that was controversial and very powerful. And it was that production, when it was performed in Buenos Aires in the early 40s, that caught the attention of director Pierre Chenal, who was Belgian and had left France, where he was working as a film director, to relocate to Argentina during the war. And when he saw that stage production, he thought, wow, this would make a tremendous movie. And interestingly, it wasn't until Richard Wright moved from France, he left the United States, moved to France, and then relocated to Argentina, where he was embraced by the intellectual community as sort of a cultural hero. And Chenal actually talked him into performing the role of Bigger Thomas himself, which is kind of amazing because he's far too old to play the part, really. So what is your take on his this rare moment where an author actually plays their creation on screen?
Well, I mean, it's one of the most fascinating aspects of this film. There's something almost surreal about this film, the way that the style of the film, the acting, the dubbing of some of the actors, as you'll see, because there are some Argentinian actors who are playing American characters. So there's just something about it that feels off. And maybe, as you're saying, Eddie, one of the most kind of off things about it is that Richard Wright, who's in his 40s, is playing Bigger Thomas, who is supposed to be 20 years old. And he's not trained as an actor. And so what we have, I think, is just this amazing historical, cultural document of an author bringing his own character to the screen and wrestling with a lot of the same kinds of issues, because Richard Wright would have wanted this to be a major Hollywood motion picture. He was interested for this to be a European production, but people wouldn't take up the controversial subject matter. And I think in Chenal, what he found is actually something that really makes this an interesting and important film, which is it connected him to this broader kind of international expatriate intellectual community of people who would take risks. And as you'll see, this is a film that is representing issues of race and gender and class in ways that Hollywood films would simply not do during this time. So Wright being there, for me, just reinforces, as awkward as his acting is, as you will see, it reinforces his commitment, his determination to bring this project to the screen.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Stick around. We want to talk about this afterwards, definitely. But here it is, set in Chicago, but made in Buenos Aires in 1950. Here is Richard Wright starring in Native Son.